That spring, every bare branch bloomed. Not the thin, hopeful blossoms of a young tree, but a thick, creamy froth of white and pink that smothered the 44 skeletons in her orchard. The scent of it rolled down the dry slope and into the town of Providence, a place that had long forgotten the smell of anything but dust and resignation. People stopped on the planked sidewalks, sniffing the air like wary animals. They looked up at the ridge where Ilara's useless plot of land sat, and they saw the impossible cloud of white against the hard blue sky. It was a miracle, they whispered. It was a trick of the light. It was an affront to the sensible order of things, where dead was meant to stay dead. For a woman who had spent a year listening to their pity and scorn, the sight of their upturned, bewildered faces was a quiet and deeply satisfying meal. But what they did not yet know, what Ilara herself was only just beginning to understand, was that the bloom was not the miracle. The miracle was still buried in the dark, rich earth below. 1 year earlier, the orchard was not a cloud, but a graveyard. Ilara had stood on the same ridge, the deed clutched in her hand, a piece of paper that felt as dry and brittle as the land it described. 44 apple trees, the lawyer had said, though he'd had the decency to look ashamed. More sticks than trees, really. The townsfolk called it the Scab, a patch of land so depleted and hard-baked that nothing but thistle and regret would grow on it. The trees were black, gnarled things, their limbs twisted into arthritic poses against the sky. They hadn't borne fruit in a generation. The purchase had exhausted the last of her inheritance, a meager sum left by parents she barely remembered. It was an act of desperation that the town of Providence interpreted as pure foolishness. "A young woman alone can't work a place like that," said Mr. Sterling, the grain dealer, his voice slick with false concern as he tilted his hat. "That land's been picked clean and salted over." He owned the valley's best bottomland, green and fat along the river, and his judgment carried the weight of coin. Others were more direct. "You'd have done better to buy a plot in the churchyard," muttered a farmer at the general store. "At least that'll hold you." Ilara listened. She did not argue. She had a habit of stillness that people mistook for slowness, a quiet way of watching that they read as vacancy. She walked the length and breadth of her new property, her worn boots scuffing on clay baked to the hardness of brick. She ran her hands over the dry, scaly bark of the trees. They felt not dead, but dormant, like creatures in a long, deep sleep. She had no money for fertilizer, no way to pipe water up the long slope from the creek that was already shrinking in the early summer heat. She had only the land, the 44 skeletal trees, and an idea that had come to her in the deep of the night. An idea so simple and contrary that it felt like a secret whispered by the land itself. It was an idea that would require patience, stubbornness, and the last of her credit. It was an idea that would make the whole town certain she had finally, truly, lost her mind. The sheep were as scorned as the land. There were 44 of them, a count that felt like fate. They were the culls from a half-dozen flocks, the runts, the ones with patchy wool or a limp or an incurable cough. Ilara bought them for a song, a sad tune played on the last of her silver. The ranchers were glad to be rid of them. "They'll die before winter, girl," one warned, not unkindly. "No meat on 'em, and their wool's hardly worth the shearing." Ilara just nodded and paid the man. She led her ragged flock up the hill, a slow, dusty procession of misery. The town watched her go. Laughter followed her, thin and sharp as cicada song. "Raising skeletons on the Scab," someone called out, and the joke was repeated at the saloon and over dinner tables for a week. She built a temporary pen of woven willow and rope under the first set of trees. The sheep huddled together, their coughing a dry, rhythmic percussion in the still air. They looked at her with dull, yellow eyes, expecting nothing. That evening, as the sun bled out behind the western peaks, her nearest neighbor, Old Man Hemlock, came calling. He was a man the town mostly ignored, an immigrant from a country they couldn't pronounce, who kept to himself and his small, impossibly lush garden. He moved slowly, leaning on a stick of polished sycamore, and handed her a pail. Inside were 3 perfect red tomatoes and a loaf of dark, heavy bread. He didn't look at her pathetic flock or her dead trees. He looked at her hands, already raw from hauling water. "The land," he said, his voice a low rumble, accented and soft. "It is not a dead thing you own. It is a living thing you partner." Ilara thanked him for the food, her voice tight. Pity was a stone in her throat. But he wasn't looking at her with pity. His eyes, nested in a web of wrinkles, were clear and steady. "You give it life," he said, tapping the ground with his stick. "It gives you life back. Simple, but not easy." It was the first kind and practical thing anyone had said to her. She held on to the words as she began her work. The arithmetic of survival was stark. 44 sheep, 44 trees, 180 days until the first hard frost. She had a small sack of flour, the tomatoes and bread from Hemlock, and a few dollars for salt and coffee. The sheep were her only moving part in the equation, her only chance to change the math. She began moving their pen every 3 days. The work was brutal. She hauled water in 2 heavy wooden buckets from the creek at the bottom of the slope, her shoulders screaming, the yoke biting into her flesh. 4 trips in the morning, 4 at night. The sheep drank thirstily, their bony bodies seeming to soak up the moisture. And as they drank, they gave back. Their manure and urine soaked into the cracked clay. Their sharp hooves broke up the hard-pan crust, churning the dry soil. They nibbled at the tough, bitter weeds that even the goats wouldn't touch, clearing the ground around the base of the ancient trees. She kept her success, what little there was of it, like a coal banked low under ash. Days bled into weeks. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the valley floor and turning the distant hills to a hazy brown. The creek shrank to a muddy trickle. The farmers in the valley, with their prime riverfront land, began to mutter about the lack of rain, their confident pronouncements turning to worried whispers. But up on the scab, Ilara worked to a rhythm of her own making. Rise before light, haul water. Move the pin, haul more water. She learned the individual character of each sheep. There was a big surly ewe with one cloudy eye she named Patches, who acted as the flock's grumpy matriarch. A young lame ram she called Skip followed her like a dog. A small, perpetually frightened one she named Ghost would only drink when Ilara stood near. A boy from town, Leo, began to appear at the edge of her property. He was about 12, a thin, quiet child with eyes that saw too much, and a habit of being underfoot and overlooked. The other boys taunted him for being clumsy, for preferring books to ball games. At first he just watched from a distance, half hidden behind a juniper bush. Ilara pretended not to notice. One afternoon, as she struggled to drag a heavy section of the willow fence, he emerged from the shade. "I can help," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Ilara straightened up, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dusty hand. She simply nodded. From then on, he came every day after his chores were done. He never asked many questions, but he was a quick and tireless worker. He helped her haul water, his thin arms straining but never giving up. He learned to mend the fences and how to gentle the skittish sheep. He gave them all names, grand and ridiculous ones from the adventure books he read. Odysseus, Beowulf, Lancelot. The flock, once a collection of coughing skeletons, began to change. The sparse, brittle wool started to fill in. The coughing subsided. A quiet life came back into their eyes. They no longer looked at her with dull resignation, but with a kind of placid trust. When she came with the water buckets, they would nicker softly, a gentle rising murmur. Ilara and Leo worked in a comfortable silence. The only sounds, the bleating of the sheep, the creak of the bucket handles, and the rhythmic scrape of their boots on the dry earth. One evening, Leo pointed to the ground where the pen had been a week before. "Look," he said. The earth was different. It was no longer pale and cracked. It was darker, almost black in the failing light, and it had a rich, loamy smell. A few tiny, tentative green shoots were pushing their way up through the newly broken soil. Ilara knelt and pressed her palm against it. It was still warm from the sun, but it felt alive, holding a secret coolness deep within. It had worked. The first part of the equation had been solved. She had given the land life, and it was stirring in its sleep. The first frost came late that year, a gift of time Ilara hadn't dared to count on. By then, the entire orchard floor had been turned over by the sheep. The soil was dark and crumbly, a stark contrast to the pale, dead clay that surrounded her property line. The sheep were fat, and their coats were thick, their raggedness replaced by a sturdy, healthy sheen. She and Leo had built them a small, sturdy shelter against the north wall of her cabin, using scavenged lumber and packed earth. She'd paid for the lumber by selling 3 of the flock's spring lambs, plump, healthy animals that fetched a surprising price at the autumn market. Mr. Sterling had been there, watching her transaction with a narrow, calculating expression. He ran a thumb over the fleece of one of the lambs. "Remarkable," he'd said, his voice holding no warmth. "I wouldn't have thought this land could support anything so vital." It was not a compliment. It was an appraisal. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. She kept her gaze steady and named her price, a fair one, and didn't look away until the money was in her hand. The winter was hard, but not unbearable. The sheep, huddled in their lean-to, provided a living warmth that seeped through the cabin walls. She spent the long, dark evenings carding and spinning the wool she and Leo had sheared. It was not the finest grade, but it was strong and warm, and she knitted herself a new pair of stockings and a thick shawl that smelled of lanolin and wood smoke. Old Man Hemlock visited occasionally, bringing a sack of potatoes or a jar of preserved beans from his own miraculous garden. He would sit by her small fire, sipping hot tea, and they would talk about the soil, the way the frost settled in the low places, the signs of a hard winter or an early spring. "You listen to the land," he told her one night, watching the firelight flicker in her eyes. "Most people, they only shout at it. They want it to give them what they want. But you listen. You heard it was thirsty. You heard it was hungry." He nodded toward the wall, where the sheep shuffled on the other side. "You brought it food and drink." As the days began to lengthen, a new kind of arithmetic started in Ilara's head. She counted the buds on the trees. At first, they were just tiny, tight knots against the black branches. But she watched them every day, her heart a tight fist in her chest. The town was still convinced of her folly. They saw a woman and a boy tending a flock of worthless sheep under a copse of dead trees. They saw wasted effort. They did not see the slow, patient miracle happening just beneath the surface. They did not smell the life in the soil. They could not feel the sap beginning to rise in roots that had slept for 30 years. Ilara kept the secret of the swelling buds to herself. She held her hope close, a fragile, living thing. Then came the spring. It wasn't a gentle arrival. It came in a rush of warm wind that swept up the valley, carrying the scent of melted snow from the high peaks. And one morning, Ilara woke to a world transformed. The 44 trees had exploded. From the ridge, it looked as if a piece of a summer cloud had snagged on her land, a riot of white and pink blossoms so thick it obscured the gnarled black branches beneath. The sight was so sudden, so overwhelming, that it stole her breath. Leo came running up the hill, his face alight with a kind of holy shock. "Ilara, did you see?" he yelled, his voice cracking. They stood together, the woman and the boy, and simply stared. The air was thick with the hum of bees, a sound the scab hadn't heard in decades. The scent was intoxicating. The whole town of Providence saw it. They couldn't miss it. The stark white bloom on the brown hill was a rebuke to their certainty. It was the first topic of conversation at the general store, at the church social, at the saloon. They had no explanation for it. They fell back on old superstitions. It was a weather sign. It was a death omen. It was some kind of blight that mimicked a bloom. Mr. Sterling drove his buggy up the road that bordered her property, stopping to stare for a long time. He did not get out. Ilara watched him from her cabin window, his silhouette rigid with disbelief. A week later, a fancy carriage pulled up, the kind that only came through Providence on its way to the capital. A man in a city suit, a chef from a famous hotel, had heard the rumors. He was a collector of rare and forgotten tastes. He walked up her path, looking not at the blooms, but at the trees themselves. "These are black wines," he said, his voice filled with reverence as he touched a branch. "An old variety. I thought they were all gone. They said the fruit was small and ugly, but the flavor was like nothing else on earth." He saw the sheep, the dark soil. He knelt and crumbled it in his fingers. He understood immediately. He looked at Ilara, his eyes sharp and appraising. "If these trees set fruit," he said, "I will buy every single apple you can harvest, and I will pay you a price that will make Mr. Sterling's best wheat look like chicken feed." He handed her his card. And just like that, the mockery of Providence was silenced, replaced by a new sound, the low, hungry murmur of envy. Ilara put the card away in a small wooden box. The arithmetic was changing again. The bees were doing their work. The petals fell like snow, and behind them she could see the tiny, green fists of nascent apples, promising a harvest that no one, not even she, had ever dared to imagine. The summer that followed was not a gift. It was a curse. The sky turned a hard, bleached white and stayed that way. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the valley day after day after day. The rains of June never came. The creek at the bottom of Ilara's hill vanished, leaving a cracked, serpentine scar of mud. By July, the Providence River itself, the lifeblood of the valley, had slowed to a sluggish, brown crawl. The men who owned the rich bottomland, men like Sterling, watched their corn wither on the stalk and their wheat turn pale before it could form heads. Their modern, shallow-rooted fruit trees, dependent on constant irrigation from the river, began to suffer. Their leaves yellowed and dropped, and the young fruit shriveled on the branch. Panic began to set in, a quiet, corrosive fear that soured conversations and shortened tempers. But on Ilara's ridge, something different was happening. The 44 ancient trees, the black wines, seemed not to notice the drought. Their deep, gnarled roots, undisturbed for a century, reached far down into the earth, tapping into reserves of moisture the shallow-rooted modern trees could never find. And the soil, the dark, rich, living soil that Ilara and her sheep had built, acted like a sponge. It held the winter moisture, hoarding it against the sun's assault. While the valley floor cracked and baked, her orchard floor remained dark and cool to the touch, just an inch below the surface. Her apples did not shrivel. They swelled. They were not large and perfect-looking like the ones Sterling grew. They were small, gnarled, and almost black-skinned, clinging to the branches in tight clusters. But they were heavy. dense with juice and sugar concentrated by the dry heat. Elara and Leo hauled water for the sheep from an old, deep well near Hemlock's property that had yet to run dry. The work was harder than ever, but it felt different now. It was the work of protecting something precious. Every day they walked the orchard, checking the fruit, their feet silent on the soft earth. The town's envy had curdled into a strange, resentful awe. They saw her green leaves against the brown landscape, and it felt like another judgment. They had laughed at her folly, and now her folly was the only thing that seemed to be thriving. The laughter had stopped entirely. Now, when she went to town for supplies, people fell silent. They watched her with a mixture of suspicion and a new, desperate kind of hope. Their own cellars were going to be empty this winter. Their fields were failing. Hunger was a real and looming possibility, and the only promise of a harvest for 100 miles was hanging from the branches of the 44 trees on the scab. Elara could feel their eyes on her back, could feel the weight of their fear. The arithmetic was no longer about her own survival. It was about the survival of them all. Mr. Sterling began his campaign with a visit. He left his fine buggy at the bottom of the hill and walked up, a thing Elara had never seen him do. He removed his hat and wiped his brow, feigning a folksy humility that didn't suit him. He marveled at the trees, at the heavy, dark fruit. "A miracle, Elara, a true miracle," he said, his voice as smooth as cream. "The whole valley is burning up, and you have an oasis." He leaned against a tree, his gaze sweeping over the orchard, counting, calculating. "Of course," he continued, his tone shifting to one of fatherly concern. "A harvest this size, it's too much for a young woman and a boy to handle. You'll need a proper crew, wagons, crates. It's a complex operation." He made his offer then. He would buy the entire crop, right on the tree. He would handle the picking, the packing, the transport. He named a price that was shockingly low, a fraction of what the city chef had hinted at. It was still more money than Elara had ever seen in her life. "It's a fair price, considering the risk," he said smoothly. "A bird in the hand, you know. You'd be secure for the winter, no worries." Elara listened, her face calm, her hands still. She looked past him, at his own fields in the valley below, a brown and withered testament to his kind of farming. She thought of the town, of the fear in their eyes. Sterling wasn't buying apples to feed Providence. He was buying them to ship to the city, to capitalize on the drought-induced scarcity and save his own fortune. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice even. "I'll think on it." His smile tightened. This was not the answer he expected from a poor, foolish woman. "Don't think too long," he warned, a hint of steel in his voice. "Fruit doesn't wait, and in times like these people can get desperate. A woman alone, with the only food for miles around, it can be a dangerous position." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of concern. He left, confident he had planted a seed of fear, but he had misjudged her. Elara was not a stranger to fear. She had lived with it as a constant companion for a year. What he didn't understand was that she was no longer one person alone. She had the boy, Leo. She had the quiet wisdom of Old Man Hemlock. And she had the 44 trees and the 44 sheep. She had a partnership with her land. The next day, he sent 2 of his hired men up the hill. They didn't approach her directly. They just sat on the road watching her, their presence a silent pressure. That evening, Elara found the gate to the sheep pen broken, the flocks scattered across the hillside. It took her and Leo hours to round them up in the dark, their calls echoing in the unnervingly quiet night. When she did the count, one was missing. It was Skip, the lame ram who always stayed close. They found him the next morning at the bottom of a ravine, his leg broken beyond mending. The arithmetic had turned cruel. The harvest began under a sky the color of ash. Ilara and Leo worked from before dawn until after dusk, their hands stained black with apple juice. The fruit was small and hard, and it took forever to fill a basket. But the baskets were deceptively heavy, dense with a sweetness that was almost painful. Old Man Hemlock came and helped, his gnarled hands surprisingly nimble. He showed them how to twist the apples from the stem without bruising them, how to lay them gently in the crates. He never spoke of Sterling, but his presence was a steady, silent shield. The town grew hungrier. The general store's supplies were dwindling, and the prices were climbing. The whispers started, fanned by Sterling's men in the saloon, that she was hoarding, that she was waiting for the price to peak so she could gouge her neighbors, that the city chef had offered her a fortune and she was going to sell every last apple out of the valley, leaving them to starve. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The fear in town was beginning to curdle into resentment, just as Sterling had planned. Ilara could feel the change. When she went for supplies, faces that had been wary were now openly hostile. No one would meet her eye. She knew a confrontation was coming. She knew Sterling was orchestrating it. He was a man who understood how to use hunger as a weapon. She could sell to the chef, take the money, and leave Providence and its judgment behind forever. It was a tempting thought. She would be safe. She would be rich. But as she stood in the orchard at sunset, the air cooling around her, she looked at the trees that had trusted her, at the sheep that depended on her. She looked at Leo, who had found a home here, his face streaked with dirt and lit with pride. She thought of Hemlock's simple words, "You give it life, it gives you life back." The life she had given this land wasn't just water and manure, it was care. The life it was giving back wasn't just apples, it was a choice. That night she did her final arithmetic. She counted the crates they had filled, stacked high in her small cabin until there was barely room to move. She estimated how many were still on the trees. She divided that by the number of families in town. She calculated what a fair price would be, not a price for profit, but a price for survival. A price that would see everyone through the winter. The number she landed on was so low it was absurd. It was an act of faith. The next morning, she sent Leo into town with a single handwritten note to pin to the door of the general store. It was not an offer, it was a declaration. The note brought them. By midday, a crowd had gathered at the bottom of her hill. They were a grim, silent mass, their faces tight with suspicion and hunger. They carried baskets, sacks, anything that would hold apples. Mr. Sterling was there, sitting in his buggy at the edge of the crowd, watching with a smug, proprietary air. He believed he had won, that he had forced her hand. He thought this was a surrender. Ilara met them at the edge of her property line. She was not flanked by hired men, only by a 12-year-old boy and an old man leaning on a sycamore stick. She stood straight, her hands clean, her gaze steady. She looked over the faces of the people who had mocked her, who had pitied her, who had resented her. She saw not enemies, but neighbors, frightened, proud, hungry neighbors. "The price is 5 cents a pound," she said, her voice clear and caring in the still air. "Enough to cover my costs and see me through the winter. You can pick them yourselves. Take only what your family needs. There is enough for everyone, if no one is greedy." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. 5 cents a pound was a gift. It was less than the price of flour, less than the price of beans. It was impossible. Sterling's face, which had been a mask of triumph, contorted in disbelief and then rage. This was not his plan. "Don't be fools!" he shouted from his buggy, standing up. "This is a trick. She has a deal with a city buyer. She's selling you the seconds, the windfalls. I have made her a generous offer for the prime fruit, an offer that would bring real money into this valley." A woman at the front of the crowd, whose husband's farm bordered Sterling's withered fields, turned on him. "An offer to do what, Mr. Sterling? Ship it all to the capital while our children go hungry? We've seen your kind of generous before." Another man spoke up. "She's offering to feed us. What are you offering? A lecture?" Sterling was sputtering, his face turning a blotchy red. He had lost control of the narrative. He had wielded their hunger against Alara, and she had turned it into a bond that excluded him. He looked at Alara, his eyes promising retribution. "You will regret this," he hissed. Alara simply looked at him. She did not need to reply. The town was already moving past her, up the hill, their faces transformed from suspicion to a kind of wondering gratitude. They moved quietly, respectfully, into the orchard, as if entering a church. They picked with a strange gentleness, careful not to break the branches. They helped each other, passing baskets, lifting children up to reach the highest fruit. Leo and Hemlock directed them, showing them which trees were ready, their voices calm and assured. Being right is its own kind of reply. Alara stood and watched as her harvest, her fortune, was carried away, basket by basket, until the entire town was fed. The winter was long, but no one in Providence starved. The black wine apples, with their dense flesh and high sugar content, were good keepers. They were stored in cool cellars, eaten fresh, baked into pies, stewed into sauces, and dried into leathery rings that tasted of sunshine and earth. The story of Alara's harvest became a local legend, told and retold around winter fires. They spoke of the foolish woman who had bought the dead orchard and how her foolishness had saved them all. They spoke of Sterling, whose greed had left him isolated and despised. His reputation, as withered as his crops, never recovered. He sold his land the following year and moved away, a man defeated not by the drought, but by a quiet woman's simple act of arithmetic and grace. When the spring rains finally returned, soft and steady, they fell on a changed valley. The people looked at the land differently. They saw not just a resource to be exploited, but a partner to be respected. Several farmers came to Alara, asking her advice. They wanted to know about the sheep, about the soil, about the old ways of listening to the land. She shared what she knew, freely and patiently. The city chef returned as promised. He was not disappointed to find most of the harvest gone. He bought what Alara had saved for herself, paying a price that ensured she would never have to worry about the arithmetic of survival again. But more than the money, he brought her seeds from other forgotten varieties of fruit, entrusting them to her care. "Some people grow for profit," he told her, his respect genuine. You grow for life." Her orchard became her life's work. She and Leo, who stayed on as her partner, planted the new seeds. The flock of sheep grew, their descendants grazing peacefully under the trees. The scab was no longer a name spoken with scorn, but with a kind of reverence. It was a place of impossible abundance, a testament to patience and care. One evening, years later, Alara was walking with Old Man Hemlock through the orchard. The trees were heavy with fruit, the air was cool, and the sheep were moving slowly through the long grass. Hemlock stopped and leaned on his sycamore stick, looking at the dark, rich earth beneath their feet. "You see," he said, his voice the same soft rumble she remembered from that first day. "You give it life. It gives you life back." He smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Simple," he said, "but not easy." Alara looked out over the valley, at the small lights of the town winking on in the twilight, a community bound together by the memory of a shared hunger and a shared feast. She had come to this place with nothing but a handful of coins and a foolish idea, a woman alone against the judgment of the world. Now she was rooted here, as deeply as the ancient trees she had saved. She was not alone. She was home.